He had everything the city measured. Land on Victoria Island, a private plane that smelled of polished leather and lemon oil, a line of houses with gates like teeth. But there was one thing that would not come back into his hands: time. The diagnosis had arrived in a quiet hospital room, black pen on white paper, and Chief Harold Williams had read it as if someone else had written of a life he had thought invincible. In the days that followed, the mansion grew larger and emptier. The marble in the hallway shone with a cold, indifferent light. The portraits on the walls seemed to lean away when he moved his head. Outside, Lagos lived on the wrong side of his size. Ajagunal pulsed with a different rhythm. Vendors calling names, boys with trays of akara, a child with a hole in his sandal holding a rubber ball like treasure. That was where Mia's life had been measured. Small rooms that shared a single socket, a mother who worked 2 jobs, a brother scraping 20 naira from a day of odd jobs. It was the place where hunger taught her to be quick with hands and words, where she learned to keep a list in the margins of her head. What was owed, who might be trusted, what could never be asked. She came to the Williams house because a woman named Nkechi from the agency said the family was looking for someone steady, and because the pay was 2 months' worth of what she could earn in Lagos markets. She said she would do anything, Mia told herself, and meant the small things, dusting the trophies that had once belonged to grandchildren she'd never met, making tea at exactly the temperature Mr. Williams liked, learning the names of plates that cost more than her rent. On her first night, she slept in the servants' quarter, under a ceiling that kept the heat in. Dawn found her at the back gate, watching the way the sunlight slid down the mansion's facade like an invitation she had no right to accept. A gardener swept past with a broom the size of a tree limb and talked to his plants as if they were relatives. Even the air inside that gate felt like an act of containment. The city beyond had the wrong smell for a place built to forget what it cost. They called him Chief inside the house in a way that softened his name into an instrument of habit. He lived in the West Wing now, a suite that smelled faintly of lavender and old books. A wheelchair sat like a throne by the window where he watched the road. He was smaller than the photographs on the wall had promised, less a mountain and more a man worn by choices. There was a gentleness in the way his fingers found the rim of his glass, the same way he found a corner of a page he wanted to read. Mia learned the rhythm of his needs before she learned his moods. Pill at 9, 2 pills at 12, a call for water at odd hours. She learned to smooth the blanket just so, to turn the radio low when the house seemed too loud with its own history. The first time he spoke to her alone, his voice came out from behind tired eyes. "You have steady hands," he said. "You are not afraid of small things." Mia laughed because she did not know how to answer the other truth. She was afraid of everything, but she kept her face neutral. "I like small things that work." There were rumors about why a man like him would keep a young maid. The daughters had their gossip, as children will gather a story and wear it to make themselves feel larger. Deborah, his wife, kept her distance as if the air itself might act as accusation. The daughters moved through the house like seasonal weather, some sudden, bright, and soon gone, others like storms stored for later. Chief noticed the way Mia hummed when she wiped windows, how she folded towels into a sort of small habitual grace. He noticed the way her face tightened at the mention of money. That was a thing he had thought he had stopped needing, the ache to know another life depended on him. But the diagnosis had reopened rooms in him that had been shut. One night he asked her to sit. They were in his study. The lamp threw a small circle of warmth across the desk. Outside, the city made vague promises in the distance. "I have been told I must make arrangements," he said without preamble. "There are things to be fixed before a man is no longer useful for making things happen." Mia met his eyes. He had the look of a man who had rehearsed humility. She had the look of a person who had rehearsed needing everything. He told her of a son he had never had. He spoke in the language of regret. Small details dropped into the air like coins. A name he had chosen once and then buried. A school uniform dismissed for lack of use. Dreams he had left to rot in briefcases. He avoided saying the word heir at first, as if it were a piece of meat that might offend. "Do you want more for your family?" he asked finally, and his voice was bare. Her breath caught. She had come to the mansion to feed her mother and to keep the lights on for her brother, not to carry the burdens of a dying man into some tangled future. But survival is a language that does not always sound like courage. It sounds like numbers counted in the head late at night. He did not offer power, he offered a promise. He had watched entitlement feed on promises and come away with rotted hands. He had watched his family stitch their hands into greed. He wanted now, in the narrowing of his time, to do something that would not be undone by his wife's appetite for inheritance. He wanted a son whose existence could be a living fulcrum to tilt the household's loyalty. "I will make what I can make," he said, "and I can make sure he is protected. I can make provision for your family. I can make it harder for those who want—" He stopped, and the study filled with the unspoken names of his daughters, to swallow everything. Mia felt the weight of his words like a hand on her shoulder. For a long time she said nothing. The room smelled of his aftershave and old paper, and beyond the glass the city went on with a rumble she recognized as indifferent. "This is not the kind of favor others would ask," she said at last, because words had to move. He cleared his throat. "You have good hands and a level head. I ask you to bear my son, to carry him, to care for him, so that when I am not here, he will be a thing that cannot be taken without consequence. I will set up a trust. My lawyer will draft it. In return, you will have protection and provision." It was not phrased as an offer. The clause slid into the room and laid itself between them. Mia thought of her mother's cough, of the way her brother had stopped going to school when the money ran out, of the landlord's threatening letters. She thought of the children in Ajagunal with clear eyes and empty plates. She felt the power imbalance as if it were a draft under a door. He was a man with a name that opened bank accounts. She was a girl whose hands still smelled of oil and cassava. Consent in that room would be measured against hunger and the promise of safety. "Why me?" she asked. "Because you are not of this house," he said simply. "You will not be beholden to them. You are small enough for people to underestimate." There was tenderness under the bluntness, a fatigue that had become moral in its plea. He had not come to offer romance. He had come with the logic of a man trying to fix a ledger that had always run into the same red. Mia went home that night with the question inside her like a stone. She did not sleep. She sat in the dim room and imagined numbers, the way they might look when arranged with assurance. She imagined a nurse's uniform for her mother, a school bag for her brother. She also imagined herself reduced to a story told at a family table, a bargaining chip that could be moved when tastes changed. In the days that followed, she was careful. She did what she had been hired to do, kept the house, made sure the tea was the right shade, learned the names of the daughters enough to avoid mistakes. She found small ways to hold steady, a line of pegs for socks, a tray arranged with the exact order of cutlery she had been taught. The smallest acts, she discovered, could be policing agents of dignity. Chief Harold, when the house allowed it, watched and asked little. He began to look forward to discussing trivialities, the angles of the sunlight on the far terrace, the smell of rain on the driveway, the way a particular bread warmed under his tongue. He liked that Mia listened. There was a softness her presence brought to the room. She sat with him while he read, and sometimes she would read aloud when his eyes failed him, and he would close his fingers around the newspaper like a relic. Word is a stealthy thing in houses with many doors. The daughter's gossip arrived like dry leaves. A servant spends too much time with him. He speaks to her as if she is someone else. Olivia, sharp and deliberate, first noticed the way Mia left the study with a straight back and an expression that suggested a conversation whose gravity did not belong to her station. Kenneth, Olivia's boyfriend, smelled intrigue like a hound. It took Amelia, ever the tattletale, deputized by her mother, to follow a trail of small clues until she had something she could turn into accusation. They found a notebook that had fallen behind a cushion, pages of chicken-scratched numbers alongside names and dates. Olivia read them in the corner of a room and puffed up with the certainty of ownership. "That's proof," she pronounced in a voice that demanded allegiance. Deborah did not waste time. She could not afford to. In a household that was opening toward its end, momentum favored those always ready to act, and Deborah had practiced in the arenas of negotiation and coldness. They stole the documents that late Sunday when the house was loud with the Sunday show playing and the daughters were arrayed in bright, borrowed clothes. It was Amelia who had followed Mia to the dresser, an excuse about misplaced hairpins, and who slid a hand into a drawer where Mia kept a small clutch. In the clutch were her life, a passport issued in the slur of her maiden name, a national ID, a scrawled receipt that proved the last transfer from an agency. Amelia's fingers were quick, and she had learned the essential skill of people who survive in houses where secrets are currency. She took what could be used and left the rest arranged to look normal. When Mia discovered the loss, her stomach did a new thing, felt like a box that had been opened. A document is more than paper. It is permission. Without it, she could not leave the country. Without it, the promise of a life that could shelter her family shrank. She went into the kitchen and tried to breathe with evenness, but her hands trembled and a cup slipped from her fingers and clattered. In that sound, she felt an accusation. She asked Deborah directly, because truth sometimes walks a path of its own, and the bold do not always wait for permission. Deborah's face betrayed nothing. "You are foolish," she said. "You should keep your things locked." Mia knew the house had its own ways of folding people into roles. She understood dimly that the theft meant more than petty cruelty. It meant obstruction. It meant that her reputation could be turned into a cautionary tale. For someone who had never belonged to the class that could buy silence, this was a theft of mobility. When she went to the study to tell Chief, it was already evening. He looked smaller by lamplight, a man condensed to his essentials. He listened, and his hand found the armrest. "They have taken your papers," he said. After a while, he didn't say they as strangers, but as a family that folded on the inside. It was Amelia, Mia said, and the name was an act of naming. He did not rise in anger. He rarely rises in anything. He rose in resolve. "Then they will not succeed," he said, and the sentence had the quality of a law being set. He called his lawyer the next morning. The lawyer came like a shadow cast by money, certain, brisk, and courteous. They spoke in a room where contracts lived in leather binders. The lawyer laid out options: trusts, immediate transfers, a will that could not easily be contested. He spoke of confidentiality clauses and executors with the cadence of an instrument being tuned. Chief wanted to place the bulk of his estate into a trust for the boy he hoped Mia would bear. He wanted disinheritance clauses that would make it costly, publicly and financially, for his family to attempt to appropriate what he intended for his son. He wanted a man named Solomon, a reliable executor who had handled difficult divisions before. He wanted the trust to be airtight. The lawyer said this could be arranged, but that it would require precision and secrecy. Secrecy was a word that cost much in that house. For Deborah, secrets were threats waiting to be neutralized. Once a document leaves a drawer, the air around it is electric. Hands are tempted to reach and rearrange the future. Chief knew that. That was why he asked that fewer people know, and why he insisted on measures that were at once legal and practical. "Take her out of the house," he said to his lawyer. "Not in a way that draws attention, somewhere they do not think to look. I will sign what must be signed. I will put it beyond their easy reach." The lawyer's eyes were kind to him and firm. "We will prepare documents for signature," he said. "We will arrange for temporary travel documents, a private transfer. We will ensure a medical facility overseas." Mia listened to the plans from a distance, because in this house her voice had rarely been required in the architecture of such decisions. To be the center of such arrangements was to be simultaneously honored and endangered. She was to be protected, yes, but for what reason? Because of dependency? Because of a bargain struck by a dying man? The thought tightened her chest. That night she went to the back gate and watched the street lamps blur into a silver smear. A boy pushed a cart heavy with plantains and laughed. His laugh was a thing that did not belong in the room of her thoughts, but rose anyway. She imagined a jet, cold, lighted stairs, and a blanket tucked around an infant. She imagined her mother in a clean uniform, a school bag on her brother's small back. She imagined being watched by women who had never been satisfied, and feared for their eyes. Deborah's plans did not wait for legalities. She met with Kenneth in the garage, where grease left fingerprints on the cement. The daughters clustered like vultures around a meeting where appetite needed an argument, and they had arguments in short, clipped bursts. "She cannot leave with anything," Deborah said, and there was no coquettishness in her voice. "Make a list. Find everything." "If he makes a will, we will contest it. We will do what we must." Kenneth, with the sleight of a man who knew the city's underbelly, smiled with teeth that did not promise tenderness. "We can delay her. We can make sure the documents don't leave the house," he offered. "There are men who know how to make things disappear." There are darker parts of a city that trade in unspoken services. When the daughters spoke of hired men, the suggestion tasted like faint perfume, expensive and intended to mask the stink beneath. They did not speak of violence outright. They spoke instead of intercepting, of making sure that travel was impossible, that a passport could be invalidated, that an inconvenient person could be hidden just long enough for a plan to be executed. Mia did not know that first. She continued to do the small acts that seemed now ridiculous and brave at once, arranging the cutlery, folding the towels. She counted the days in her head like beads. When she found that her body had changed one morning, nausea like a small animal in the ribs, she did not at first let the thought settle. But soon the idea would not be banished. She bought a packet of cheap pregnancy tests from a store nearby and hid it in the pocket of her uniform. The test told her, in an abrupt, astonishing way, that she had a thing that belonged to neither the house nor the street, a child on the cusp of being. She sat on the kitchen step and felt the floor steady under her feet, and for a wild, brief moment she imagined the boy receiving his name and being welcomed into the world, as if that act could heal all wrongs. She told the chief in the study, where light pooled like a map. He closed his eyes and nodded, as if he had expected this and not expected it at all. He took her hand, and his fingers were cool. "We must be careful," he said. "This changes everything." "Everything?" she echoed, because she did not yet know the vocabulary of being the mother of a man who could command a will. "Not only the legal thing," he said. "Your life, theirs, how they will move. I will have to act in ways I should have done sooner." There was gratitude there, and fear. He arranged medical care through channels that smelled of discreet corridors and invoices marked private. He signed papers that would designate a trust, and placed the lawyer's hand over the forms with an authority that made the room feel solid. When Deborah heard the news through a conversation she had intercepted carelessly, her face hardened. She called her daughters together, and they read the mood of the house like a prophecy they had no desire to accept. "This is how they will try to take what is ours," she said, and the daughters repeated words that could be shaped into plans. They stole again, but this time they took from the small, dark places where people put things they do not trust the world to keep. Mia slept and woke to find further evidences of erasure. A savings book gone from her bag, a small envelope with money she had tucked away, a photograph missing from a pocket. It was as if the house itself was reading her and deciding what she was allowed to own. Chief's resolve hardened into measures. He ordered that certain doors be locked and that only a handful of staff be told about the travel plans. He used the wheelchair as not only a necessity, but as an instrument. Having to be pushed meant he was less likely to be spirited away for confrontation. He insisted on the presence of a nurse who had worked with him for years and trusted her with a key to the plan. "You must leave before they can act," he told Mia one evening, the words a compass for a life rearranged. "We will move quickly and quietly. You will go to a place where you can give birth safely. We will keep you safe while I still can sign things. But you must trust us." Trust is a brittle object in houses where people learn early that loyalty is transactional. Mia weighed his offer like a stone in her palm. To go would mean losing what remains of the familiar, the narrow rooms in Ajagunal, the single lamp that had been hers. To stay would mean risking the slow attrition of dignity by a family who saw her as a thing to be squashed underfoot when appetite called. She agreed. It felt like stepping into a river whose depth she had not measured, but at least the current promised forward. They prepared fake receipts, temporary documents, a cloak of legitimacy that made the airport staff look away without question. A nurse booked a room in a hospital abroad under an assumed name. The lawyer printed pages with the seal of a trust that moved like an anchor through the house's daily operations. Chief signed with a hand that trembled and held on longer than it should have to the pen. When the papers were complete, he slid a small envelope across the desk to Mia. "It is not yet safe to show it to everyone," he said. "Keep this. Keep hope." She took the envelope like something holy, and for one moment allowed herself the thought that the future might be something more than a ledger. The night they chose to move her, the house was noisy with people who believed Sunday invited show. The garden smelled of fried plantain and perfume. Laughter spilled like coins. Cars lined the drive, and Deborah stood at the top of the marble steps as if architecture could guard against grief and cunning. They used the back gate. The driver was a man who knew how to make silence into something that held a body. The nurse walked with Mia as if she were sliding between pages of a book, careful and watchful. The lawyer rode with a face made of maps and numbers. Chief watched from the study window as they loaded a small suitcase into the car. When they reached the secondary gate, a shadow moved in the hedgerow that had not been there before. Two men stood just beyond the comfort of the headlights. They were not supposed to be there. No plan mentioned them. No threat had been so blatant. "Stop the vehicle," one of the men said, as if the house had always been expected to obey such commands. Tension, like a wire, took hold of the car. The nurse tightened a hand around Mia's elbow. The driver looked in the rearview mirror, his eyes trying to compute whether the motion toward the gate would become a trap. Inside the house, a light in a second-floor window blinked and went out. From the shadowed embrace of the hedgerow, a low engine rumble made itself known. Names collided in the back seat like loose stones. Amelia, Kenneth, the girls' faces formed into resolve. The daughters had resources. The shape of their scheming had become something with teeth. Chief placed his palm flat against the window and watched them go. A man trying to press against the course of a thing that would not be halted by desire. He had arranged legal levers, and yet the world contained hands not willing to wait for courts and papers. Mia's breath stuck in her throat as the car rolled forward, and the men at the gate stepped into the light. Her mind wanted to number things, the steps one could take, the distance to the nearest open road, the possibility of retreat. But some things are not computational. They are sudden, animal responses. The men stepped closer, and one of them produced a phone. He flicked through the screen with a casualness that was practiced, and, in the space between a breath and the next, the driver's door opened, and he was no longer a familiar figure, but a body in a movie whose scene had shifted to danger. Mia's hand found the envelope in her pocket. It was small, but heavy with consequence. The nurse's voice rose into the night, sharp, a calling card for help. And the lawyer's shouted words lodged in the air like thrown stones. Chief pushed himself to the window and watched them unfold like a play he had not auditioned for. In that breath, the mansion's faces gathered, some at the top of the steps, some hidden in the curtains, and watched a moment meant to be hidden become public. The daughters' profiles were dark against the light. Deborah's lips formed something like a prayer and a command. The man moved with an efficiency that told of a practiced eye for opportunity. The driver cursed and shoved, and a scuffle broke into the near silence of the gated street. Mia heard a snap, the sound of a bag striking pavement, then a laugh like a knife. Hands reached for the envelope. For a heartbeat, she thought of the children in Ajagunal and of the way the sun had looked on market days. She thought of the way a promise could be kept if only a person moved fast enough. Then a car horn screamed from the street, a sound that cut through the paralysis. Someone hit the edge of a tire. The men glanced up. In that hesitation, a new decision had to be made. Fight, flee, surrender. Chief did not move from the window, but his voice came down the line like an order, worn and absolute. Drive, drive now. The driver obeyed, the car leapt forward, and a hand clawed at the back of the seat. Mia's fingers tightened on the envelope until her knuckles struck like bone. The men shouted, then cursed, then were left in the widening blur of taillights as the car swallowed the distance. It was not victory. It was not safety, only motion. Behind them, the mansion held its breath, and inside it, the daughters rearranged their faces into shapes that promised a return. Ahead, the road led to an airport whose name tasted of departure. The private jet would wait like a sleeping animal, and beyond its doors, the world would be different. Mia sat with her pulse pounding in her ears, and thought of how precarious a thing trust could be. Blood and law braided together. She had crossed a threshold not of her making. Around her, those who had promised protection kept their silence and their eyes. The lawyer reached across his lap and handed her a paper with a signature that meant something, a document that was the length of hope. She smoothed it like a cloth and placed it beside the envelope. As the city fell away around them, the knowledge of what they had done settled into her like a second skin. She was moving toward a life that would demand courage she did not yet possess. The plane would be cold and strange. The nurse would be a stranger who might become friend. The baby inside her, if indeed the test had been right, was a future that would be disputed long after she had learned to hold him to her breast. In the back seat, she pressed her forehead to the window and watched the lights of Lagos blur into a river of stars. She thought of the market vendors, of her mother's laugh, of a brother who would be embarrassed to receive help, and yet might one day accept it with the same stubbornness she knew in herself. She felt the weight of Chief's final wish like a chalice pressed into her hands, heavy, cold, and luminous at the rim. Nothing yet was resolved. The daughters would not stop. The men at the gate could return with other plans. The law could be painstaking and slow, and greed is patient with paperwork but quick with knives. For now, Mia had a small envelope, a signed paper, and the low, steady sound of the engine beneath her. She had, too, a body that betrayed its future in small betrayals of nausea, and a secret that would soon be public in ways she could not imagine. Chief Williams watched as the car disappeared down Bishop Olawole Road, and the house swallowed back its voices, preparing for a war it had not yet named. He pressed his palm to the glass and felt the coolness of his palm and the heat of his failing breath. He had made a choice. He had asked a girl to carry his name forward. He had tried to build an impenetrable thing with lawyers and signatures. Outside, the city was indifferent. And inside, decisions would be made and undone in the hours to come. What would follow was a tangle of law and hunger, of loyalty and malice. For Mia, the road ahead would demand that she learn to keep counting despite fear. The days to the plane, the hours before the birth, the signatures that would one day decide where millions of Naira landed. At the airport, the private jet's steps unfolded like an invitation. Nurses in soft uniforms guided them through doors that smelled of solvent and coffee. A man in a suit took Mia's hand and smiled with the kind of smile practiced by people paid to soothe. The envelope was hidden in her bra, close to the warmth that would, one day, hold the baby. She felt ridiculous and powerful at once. As she climbed the stairs, she did not know if the men from the gate had given up or were simply waiting for a new opportunity. She did not know if Deborah would soon be gathering signatures and accusations. She did not know whether the trust would hold when finally under scrutiny. What she knew was this: Chief had given her a choice of sorts, and she had accepted it. The city behind them glowed with its small mercies. Ahead, the jet's door slid shut and the hum began. A small engine at first, then sound that would lift them into a sky where decisions could be made in new light. Mia pressed the envelope to her heart and thought of the baby she might cradle. She thought of Ajagunal and the small room with the single socket. She thought, with a kind of terrible hope, that perhaps a son born to a man of means could change the arithmetic of her family's life. Perhaps. She did not imagine the lies that would grow like mold in the attic of the Williams home. She did not imagine the money that would buy witnesses and the resentment that would accumulate like debt. She did not imagine the names the daughters would write in notebooks in the small hours. She did not imagine the way being wanted could become a weapon. The jet cleared the clouds, and Lagos shrank to a cluster of lamps, then to an idea. The nurse tightened a strap, and Mia watched the horizon as if it were a promise being written in light. She closed her eyes and tried to picture a future that might hold her family safe. Below, the Williams mansion sat framed by its marble and gates, and the daughters leaned against a pool table, their faces hard as coins. Deborah dialed numbers with a calmness that had always unnerved the staff. Somewhere in the city, a man with grease on his palms checked his phone and smiled at a message. Plans were maps, and maps were made to be redrawn. The jet's engine rumbled like a heartbeat, and there, in the hum, Mia felt both very small and very large. She had been entrusted with something that could be a link or a dagger. Whoever would try to reach for it would find she could not be around forever. She pressed a hand to her stomach, as if the smallness inside were also an altar. Outside, the world turned. Inside, a will had been made, and a woman from Ajaguna had accepted a wish that would change many lives. The choices to come would be harder than a journey to another country. They would ask of her a set of loyalties and a courage to ask for more than someone dying could give. Below, in the house that had once been everything, the daughters started to count losses and plot gains. Above, the jet cut a line through the sky. In the thinness of air, Mia thought of the way a promise could be both burden and blessing, and she knew that the story of what would follow was only just beginning. If you want to know what happens next, if you want to follow Mia as the trust is drawn, as the family tightens their net, and as the consequences of a dying man's wish begin to unfold, subscribe to stay with the story. Share it with someone who likes the dark turns of family secrets, and be sure to come back for the next episode. The plane settled into the slow, domestic patience of descent. Through the small window, a coastline unrolled. Roofs penciled in red, ships like slow punctuation marks, river mouths bright as fresh wounds. Mia breathed with the engine, with the straps that held her, with the thin rhythm of a body that had been remade around an other life. The nurse kept her hand on Mia's wrist as if steadying more than pulse. The man in the suit stood a fraction away, an island of calm arranged in a new suit and a practiced smile. They moved through the airport with careful, rehearsed ease. No one asked unnecessary questions. A driver in a blacked-out car took them from glass to glass, through a city that knew how to swallow names and spit out stories. The hotel suite where they stopped smelled of linen and antiseptic. The bed was high and soft, and Mia, whose life had been held for months in the small geography of Ajaguna, found the neutrality of the sheets as bewildering as any luxury. Labor began like an argument she had not invited. It arrived in patient, increasing waves. Then, in the middle of night, pale with city lights, in the hush between breaths, the small alien cry a woman waits decades to hear. When the baby was lifted, raw and damp and impossibly small, Mia felt something unfastened inside her, fear braided with a kind of lightning worship. The nurse placed the child on her chest. The infant's fingers were lamps of wanting, the curl of a tiny fist and the weight of consequence. "He's strong," the nurse said, an ordinary sentence that licensed Mia to say the baby's name before she had thought one properly chosen. She said it aloud, as if the sound could claim the life before her. "Emmanuel," she whispered, and then Chike. Names stitched together from the places that had held her: home, hope, prayer. The child burrowed, blinked light into being, and Mia repeated the names like a vow. Outside the soft cocoon, a different industry began to move. In Lagos, Deborah sat in a cool room where photographs of the family hung like medals. Her fingers tapped a pen, a syncope of readiness. She had not slept. Why sleep when the world was a document waiting to be cut? A small army of lawyers fit into the margin of her life. A man with an appetite for precedent, a younger woman with a taste for injunctions, a solicitor who spoke in clauses and promises. They spoke of the will as if it were a wound to be stitched closed. Undue influence, lack of capacity, the formalities of execution. If a signature could be questioned, Deborah wanted to be the one to hold the magnifying glass. "File in Federal High Court," she said, the words a neat order. "Temporary injunction to freeze any disposition of funds until paternity and the circumstances of the will can be fully investigated." The lawyers, who lived on contingencies and paper, smiled the smile of people who know the law can be a slow, suffocating animal. They would move quickly enough to bite. On the ground floor of a motor park, where engines coughed and men argued over battery prices, a jagunal checked his phone again. He had watched Mia walk up the jet steps with a small, furious pride, a feeling that made his stomach ache. The message that made him smile had been brief and luminous with currency. Confirmation sent, await instructions. The sum he had been promised for a small silence would change the arithmetic of his next months. He thought of the single socket, of the small lamp that had once been enough for two to read by. He took the money as a rope thrown across a chasm. Yet, when he closed his fist around his phone, he felt the envelope, no, the absence of it, like a grain of sand under his nail. Back in the suite, Mia signed the small stack of papers the man in the suit brought. Consent forms, declarations, the fine print columns that arranged legal parenthood like furniture in a house. She did not read all the clauses. She trusted the man's smile as much as a bird trusts a branch. The envelope, still warm against her skin, sat in a drawer, its paper soft and authoritative. It contained the instrument, instructions, signatures, a clause that would, if enforced, put a portion of the estate into a trust for this child, to be managed by trustees appointed by chief. It was both a promise and a weapon. The baby slept, a small, faultless thing. For a handful of hours, Mia let herself exist in the narrowed world of a crib and a breast, of the nurse's low voice and the hum of distant traffic. Outside the suite, the legal gears began to mesh. Calls, filings, anticipations. Deborah's daughters moved like predatory instruments. They called old friends, coaxed statements from staff, scoured photographs for any hint that could be made to read like deception. If a smile, a word, a photograph could be used to impugn the testimony that had stood when their father voiced his last wish, they would find it. Then a third disruption arrived, a call to the man in the suit from an unfamiliar number. He answered in a voice that slid into protocol. The person on the line spoke carefully, putting the words together as if choosing stones. "We've received an application," the caller said. "Matter has been set down for urgent hearing. The applicant alleges impropriety in the execution of the will and seeks an interim order." The man's jaw tightened. "Is there an order yet?" "Not yet," the voice said. "But they have the affidavit. They are moving to seal bank accounts linked to the estate's operating companies." "Seal?" The man in the suit laughed, an almost cordial sound that carried no warmth. "We anticipated petitions. We have structures in place. Notify the trustees, prepare disclosure, and," he paused, then added in the quiet way of people who count costs, "keep the child's identity off public record for now." "Off public record," the caller repeated, and the man in the suit put the phone down and looked at Mia. The words that followed were careful, gentle in their legalism, but their meaning was the same as a blade: stay out of sight. Mia looked down at the sleeping smallness in her arms and felt the weight of names and jurisdiction. The nurse adjusted blankets and made a promise that had nothing to do with law, to keep them safe while she could. But safety was a provisional thing. The world beyond doors was busy arranging alarms. In Ajaganal's room, after his laugh with the money, after the quiet sip of the last beer in a battered can, there came a knock on the door. Two men stood there, one known for a scar across his knuckles, the other with an even, businesslike face. They had come with gentle words that smelled faintly of threats. "We have instructions," the scarred man said, "to make sure things remain as they are." Ajaganal's palms were suddenly empty of the phone's comfort. He remembered Mia on the jet, the look she had given him when she left, a promise to return in some way. He thought of the envelope, of the baby now in a hotel suite under alien light. He had been given a rope and used it. Ropes can be ties or harnesses. He stood, dust motes in the shaft of light, and felt small as a coin. That night, while the baby slept like a bell wound down, and while lawyers in Lagos wrote affidavits with the clean, fierce patience of people who write futures, the trust, already inked, already a thing, is both lifeline and battlefield. Mia lay awake long after the nurse had gone, counting in the hush. Hours until the hearing, hours until a hearing could transform a father's last wish into a legal war. Hours until her name and her son's might be read aloud in a courtroom with voices that had the authority to break and bind. She felt for the envelope in the drawer, and with a hand that trembled, tightened her fingers around paper and possibility. The child moved, small and hungry for a tomorrow that did not yet exist. She pressed her own palm to his chest and remembered the village light of Ajagunal and the small socket that had once been the only lamp in their lives. She whispered the names again into the dark. In Lagos, Deborah's voice was a wire stretched taut. She had her petition, her sworn statements. She had positioned witnesses and the machinery of challenge. Her daughters slept with the fervor of people who believe victory is a proper inheritance. Outside both the suite and the mansion, other hands worked. A banker tallying where assets might be diverted. A trustee signing a paper at night under a reading lamp. A reporter catching the shape of a story that smelled like gold and grief. The city, indifferent and vast, folded these movements into its ordinary appetite. And somewhere between the legal filings and the lullaby hummed in a foreign hotel suite, a child slept and dreamed without knowledge of contracts. His breath was small and exact. For Mia, the road ahead, the counting of hours, the lining up of signatures, the test of loyalties, had only intensified. The envelope in her drawer was both altar and claim. The child against her chest was both miracle and responsibility. She rose in the middle of the night and watched him breathe until the first clean gray of dawn made a map across the blinds. A message arrived on the man in the suit's phone before sunrise. The court in Lagos had granted a short date for the hearing, but had not yet issued a restraining order. The lawyers on both sides were mobilizing. Files were being couriered, affidavits were being notarized in a hurry. Mia slept a little after that, an exhausted shore. She slept with the terrible comfort of someone who knows that every small thing may be argued over in the morning. When the light truly came, she would press the envelope again, and then she would decide what to do with the papers she carried so close to her skin. For now, with the baby's tiny hand curled against her heart, she allowed herself a sliver of tenderness, enough to warm and not to blind her to the coming day. In Lagos, Deborah's car pulled away from the gates of the mansion under a sky that had not yet chosen to rain. She drove to the law firm, to the room where the affidavits lay like weapons on the table. The daughters would be there soon, faces made of resolution. The quiet before the hearing was a taut instrument. Each side tuned its strings. And in a hotel suite far from the marble and the pool table, Mia rocked the child and watched the clock. The city outside had not forgotten how to scheme. Neither had the daughters, neither had the law. The child's small thumb found its way into his mouth. Mia whispered the names she had chosen as if naming could make a future steady. There would be a court, and there would be witnesses, and there would be counts and counters. and lives would be catalogued and disputed. For now, the morning was a soft rim of light. The judge's chamber, private and inevitable, smelled faintly of lemon oil. Clerks sorted files in a soft, businesslike way. Inside the courtroom, a silence gathered before it became procedural motion. Cases were called, dismissed, postponed, lives rearranged in the mild whir of legal machinery. Mia's name was announced last, as if it had been waiting its turn on purpose. She sat on the hard bench, feeling the baby's weight and the envelope's outline, and the way her own breath seemed loud in her ears. Kemi moved with practiced economy, filing papers, whispering instructions. She handed Mia a visitor's card with a small, steady hand. "Don't answer questions beyond what I coach you on," she murmured. "You'll be asked where he was found, who his father was to you. You say what you know, nothing more." The daughters entered like a shore in armor. They had rehearsal for this. Their clothes were exact as prayers. One of them carried a leather folder, the edges worn where fingers had fussed. Deborah watched them mount their case as a commander might choose battlements. Her eyes, when they found Mia, registered an expression that was all business, layered over an honest animal caution. A bailiff called the case. The room leaned forward, as if expecting thunder. The trustee had his counsel. Deborah's affidavits sat like folded knives on the table. On the other side, Kemi rose, the baby wrapped carefully in a blanket, Mia at her elbow. There was an audible intake in the room, at the sight of the child, the human center around which paper and claim now circled. The core of the morning's contest was technical in phrasing and raw in consequence. The trust, duly signed and witnessed, directed assets and guardianship in ways that favored the decedent's daughters, whose names were written plainly. Mia's petition asked the court to recognize the decedent's personal acknowledgement, the letter in the envelope, as evidence that the child was the decedent's natural offspring, and that his expressed wishes for guardianship should be enforced, or at least given substantial weight. Deborah's team would argue for the formalities, the trust, the signed documents, the certainty of legal instruments. They would talk about intent and capacity and undue influence. Mia's counsel would speak of fidelity, of the intimate note written by a man who had known his responsibility and who had placed this child within his last instructions. Kemi presented the envelope to the court clerk, asking politely that it be accepted under seal. The judge's clerk turned it over to the bailiff with the procedural solemnity of a ritual. At the bench, the judge, a woman who preferred to speak rarely and to let her rulings be the loudest language, listened to the summary of positions and then looked at Mia as if she were deciding whether to measure mercy with a ruler. "You understand," Kemi said into the silence that followed, "that a hearing like this can be more than paper." Azah! The envelope's edges were softened now by her grip, and in them she felt the trace of a life she had not asked for, and that had been made heavy by other people's design. The recess ended, and the judge called the room back to order. The bailiff's footsteps were like a metronome toward inevitability. People took their places. The judge read her interim ruling with the calm precision of someone dispensing weather. She would neither remove the child from Mia's care, nor decree the daughter's guardianship at that hour. She would, instead, grant an interim protective order that the child remain where he was, pending fuller verification of the envelope and hearing of witnesses. She scheduled a fuller hearing within weeks and ordered that both parties exchange exhibits and those from Ajagunal be made available through affidavits. For a moment the room held its breath at the balance struck. It was neither triumph nor defeat. It was a pause on the seesaw. Deborah's mouth thinned into a line that was not defeat but promise. The trustee closed his ledger with a quiet click and leaned toward counsel. The reporters adjusted their notes. Outside, the city took the news as it took so many things, a thing to digest and move on from. Kemi exhaled and let herself be human for the first time that morning. She smiled, small and tired, and took the baby's hand so Mia could straighten. "We have time," she said. "Not much, but some." Mia felt a strange gratitude that was edged with fatigue. She had bought herself a moment, and moments were the currency of endurance. She folded the envelope back into her palm, as if she could compress fate into paper. In that brief victory, among the low murmur of departures and the courthouse's steady breathing, she understood the work ahead. Witnesses to find, voices from a village to be given voice in a city courtroom, a trust to interrogate, a family to resist or to reconcile. As they stepped back out into Lagos light, the city spread around them, indifferent but exacting. The battle lines had not shifted. The instruments of claim were only more visible now. The baby slept like a bell that had learned to keep time. Mia pressed the envelope once more to her skin and walked toward the taxi rank with Kemi at her side, toward a week mapped by filings and flights and small, consequential choices. The dawn had broken, but the day still had its long argument ahead.